Hey Untold Radio Network fans, want exclusive perks and to support our channel? Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Good evening, all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes. Welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and I just got back from an incredible trip to Seattle, or more to the point, to the Des Moines area of Seattle, and to Maury Island, which, of course, is where the infamous Maury Island incident is said to have taken place. And I went there, or I traveled there, to film for my upcoming feature documentary, The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers. To actually go to Maury Island, to stand on the beach where it supposedly happened on the 77th anniversary of the incident was just incredible. And then to go to the Men in Black bash that they have there, the Men in Black Birthday Bash Festival, on the day of the first Men in Black appearance, when Harold Dahl, the witness of the Maury Island incident, was allegedly terrorized by the very first report of a modern man in black, was also just an incredible trip. And speaking of the man who invented flying saucers, I have one of the main interviewees for that feature documentary with me today. He also appears in my short documentary, The Shaver Mystery, which is currently doing the festival circuit, and I believe is next playing at the Roswell Daily Record Film Festival in early July. He's just an incredible guy. I always love having him on the show because he's so knowledgeable about all of these type of things. And tonight we're going to be talking about Summer of the Saucers, that very first UFO wave, which was kicked off by Kenneth Arnold and then the Maury Island incident, and went through Roswell and on and on and on to be probably the most significant UFO wave in modern history. Anyway, my guest has been fascinated by the unexplained for over a half century. There were 2 major events that inspired his interest in this, and one was growing up in Michigan, and the March 1966 UFO flap occurred virtually in his backyard. The following November, a winged humanoid chased 2 couples down a lonely country road near Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and the legend of the Mothman was born. Our guest would be chasing the Mothman for the rest of his life. Influenced primarily by Keel and Jacques Vallee, his views on UFOs became unconventional and moved toward a more paranormal explanation. His main area of research is what some call high strangeness, or window areas, as Keel dubbed them, where disparate types of paranormal phenomena all seem to occur in the same location. And he believes that studying these paranormally active locations may well be the key to understanding the origin of these manifestations. He has his own podcast called The High Strangeness Factor on the Paranormal UK radio network, and is a correspondent on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files, which can be found on that same network. He currently lives in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and works at the Mothman Museum. He is also writing a book, as yet untitled, that deals with the underlying patterns that connect different types of paranormal phenomena throughout history. So I'm delighted to welcome back to Talking Weird one of my all-time favorite guests and very good friend, Steve Ward.
Well, thanks for having me back, Dean. It's a real pleasure.
Man, it's just like chatting to another friend and fellow saucer geek every time I have you on. So it's always just an amazing time. We should maybe say hello to a few people in the chat because there's folks there already. There's Catherine Fourfeathers. Thank you for joining us. Flat Rockland. We very much appreciate having you here as well. Horace Smith is one of our regulars, and it's lovely to see you, who is also Professor Emeritus of Astronomy and Physics at Michigan State University. And of course, our very good friend Susie Bastille, the Pukwudgie Whisperer, is there as well.
I want to say hi to the Pukwudgie Whisperer.
Oh, of course. And it goes on. Hair Force One is here. Joe Fox is here. Mr. Big 65 is here. A good friend of mine, Wayne Klingman, Ken Rock. So thank you all. Please ask your questions and comment because it's going to be a heck of a show. I'll tell you what, Steve, I'm feeling particularly inspired about this tonight because as I was saying in my intro, I just got back from Maury Island, and what an incredible experience that was.
What were your feeling about the Maury Island incident before going out there? I mean, it's one of those things where there's so much negative about it, and a lot of people the very positive things about it. You hear it repeated over and over again. I just was curious as to what, especially being out there, what were your feelings?
That's a good question, and I might also segue into something somebody said to answer that. Flat Rockland said, "I hate to break Dean's heart and tell him that this slag he touched was probably slag from the Asarco, is that how you pronounce it, stack that used to be in Ruston there, because of course, as I mentioned on the show before, I've handled one of the pieces, the last remaining piece of slag that Harold Dahl and Fred Chrisman sent Raymond Palmer, which triggered all of this. Now, why I was so excited holding the slag wasn't because it was or wasn't part of a flying saucer. It was because this slag is what triggered so much of modern UFO phenomena. And whether it was a hoax by Fred Chrisman and Harold Dahl, whether it was some type of disinformation campaign as people who link Fred Chrisman to various military intelligence agencies, whether it was a genuine part of some secret US test flight, or whether it was extraterrestrial, whatever it was, my interest in it as a social historian and my interest in Maury Island, to get to your point, Steve, is that without this incident, so much of the things which we take for granted as modern UFO belief might not have penetrated our consciousness as much as they did, because today everybody talks about Roswell like that was the defining moment. Well, as you and I both know, Roswell, for starters, took place a few weeks after the Maury Island incident was meant to have taken place. And after the Roswell story exploded on the newswires of the day, when the Army Air Force came out a day later and just kind of retracted the story and said it was a weather balloon, all of ufology, all of sorcerdom forgot that story until the late 1970s, early 1980s. So much so, as I say, I have a number of different UFO encyclopedias, but I have two major ones from 1980, Margaret Sax's and Ronald Story's. And neither of those encyclopedias printed in 1980 even mention Roswell. It's not an entry, let alone a word in there. So the very fact that Roswell now is looked at as the defining UFO crash didn't used to be the case. It was Maury Island, and many thanks to Raymond Palmer, who pushed the story in Fate magazine, pushed the story in The Coming of the Saucers, pushed the story in everything else, because he was the person who instigated really the interest in it. When Fred Chrisman and Harold Dahl shipped that slag to Ray Palmer, if Ray Palmer had got that slag and said, this is just nonsense, Kenneth Arnold never would have gone there to investigate it, which meant Kenneth Arnold never would have called in the two Air Force officers to help him investigate it. And of course, those Air Force officers died flying back to their base after they took some of the slag themselves that Fred Chrisman gave them. So this whole kind of conspiratorial narrative of UFO crashes and cover-ups, and in fact, it's the first Air Force casualty in history. The U.S. Air Force had just become the U.S. Air Force. So all of these things which are part of UFO belief today, not to mention Men in Black, because in that book, Coming of the Saucers, and in the Fate issues as well, I believe, written by Kenneth Arnold and written by Ray Palmer, talks about, without using the term Men in Black, talks about a man in a black suit driving a black sedan who approaches Harold Dahl, takes him to a cafe, and tells him every single detail of what he was meant to have seen. Whether it's true or not, it's in the narrative. and then warned him not to tell anybody about it. And then, of course, Gray Barker, a couple of years after that book, did They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers and elaborated on that mythology. But that mythology comes out of whether Dale had the experience or not. It certainly comes out of Ray Palmer's and Kenneth Arnold's book. So the significance, I think, of Maury Island, the significance of the slag, regardless of the reality behind it, is the impacts it had on our belief system going forward as people interested in this space. So going to Maury, just like touching the slag, it's a long kind of answer to your question, but I think it's what I'm interested in, so I've elaborated. Just being on Maury Island, it was being aware that I was at a place where all of this mythology is linked to. So it was quite a cool experience.
And it seems to me the first alleged crash saucer that people were talking about was actually Aztec, covered by Frank Scully and Behind the Flying Saucers. A lot of people confuse that with Roswell. But again, like you said, Roswell was under the radar until, I guess, Stanton Friedman was the guy that kind of uncovered that.
Mm-hmm. And with William Moore as well, of course. And William, yep. I mean, Stanton Friedman did a lot of the research and helped Moore and Berlitz with that first Roswell book. But we now know that by William Moore's own admission, and Rick Doty's backed it up, and we all know that William Moore was an asset of the AFOSI, Air Force Intelligence, spreading all kinds of disinformation. Now, supposedly this disinformation campaign wasn't related to the Roswell story, but we know it was related to the MJ-12 documents, which is another part of this mythology which is meant to come out of 47. So, I take Roswell with as big a grain of salt, let's put it that way, as I take the Maury Island incident.
Right. I think there's a lot of problems with Maury Island, but you're right. It's when you talk about the mythology and the way this has built up. I always wondered, if Fred Crispin first kind of came on the scene within this realm with Palmer and Amazing Stories in an anonymous letter, it was dealing with the Shaver mystery. He claimed that he and his buddy were shot down during World War II near Burma, and they were in a cave and they were attacked by these creatures, which were apparently the Darrow, and his buddy got zapped by a heat ray. And he's begging Ray Palmer to stay away from this because this is just, going down the road to perdition or whatever. And then later on, another letter he sends, we find out it's Fred Crispin. Well, there's all kinds of, I don't know about what Fred Crispin was. I mean, was he really on the grassy knoll? I mean, he was called before one of those investigations. But here's one thing I do know, and I can't remember the names, but I'm trying to remember the name of the author now. It'll come to me. But there's a book called Strange Skies or whatever. Jerome Clark, a great researcher. He apparently covered. There was a reporter that now Harold Dahl, of course, was supposed to be on the boat that saw the 5 donut-shaped saucers and the slag fell down and so forth. And apparently he was being interviewed on the back porch by this reporter whose name I can't remember. It's all in the book. And all of a sudden, Harold Dahl's wife blasts out the back door and she's got a butcher knife in her hand. And the reporter thinks, okay, this is going to be my last report I'll ever write. And but she grabs her husband by the scruff of his neck, by his collar, and says, "Stop embarrassing me with your lies." And so then Harold Dahl says, well, this whole thing was cooked up by Fred Crispin, and he even rented a house and had a fake woman in there as a secretary that to fool Kenneth Arnold. I mean, it was just this incredible, according to Dahl, incredible elaborate hoax for why. And the real tragedy is that some of these Air Force officers that got involved with it didn't really seem to think there was much to it, but they took some of the slag back. And when they took off, the plane crashed. I mean, what a horrible, bizarre set of circumstances that were triggered through all this, which begs the question: what did Dahl really experience? I mean, was it really a man that he encountered, or was this just another story? But the other thing is that this is, if people want to look into this, there are so many levels to this, because Kenneth Arnold was being monitored apparently in his motel room, and somebody was listening. So it was like some kind of elaborate investigation or elaborate scheme or whatever. For what reason, I have no idea.
I think that's one of the great mysteries of Maury? What was the purpose? If it was just a hoax, was there some? I mean, I've read everything from that Chrisman was some disinfo agent, was covering up some Boeing crash or something, all the way down to, Fred Chrisman was just a nut who liked conspiracy theories, all the way, of course, to that actually something did happen there. Interestingly enough, on the weekend, I interviewed Steve Edmiston for the documentary, and Steve runs a number of events there, which I might put up on screen. One is Burning Saucer, and this year, I think it was a Klingon warship or something they made, but every year for about the last 10 years now, there's been a private event, and you can see, I believe that's Maury Island in the background across the bay to the right there. They burn a spaceship in memory of what happened at Maury Island this year 77 years ago, and they wear tinfoil hats, and it's a big celebration. But he also now runs another event, which is a public event. You can actually get tickets to it, called the Men in Black Birthday Bash. And here is something, both of these screen grabs are from the feature. Not that I've edited it yet, but I shot them on the weekend, very early color grade, so it's probably not perfect. But they do an event on June 22, which memorializes Dahl's encounter with the Men in Black. And they do even a fun ritual where they're at a specific time, they all put on the sunglasses, and then they all point to Maury Island and say, "Remember Maury Island," because from that event too, you can see Maury Island across the bay. Now, the point I was getting at with that is, when I spoke to Steve, he's a lawyer and he's also an historian, is that he obtained through AFOSI requests, the FBI reports and some military reports, I believe, about Maury Island. And the investigating officer, I forget his name, from the FBI, who was out of the Seattle branch, interviewed Dahl, and supposedly, and the reports are there, so it's not even supposedly, it's true, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, was so fascinated with sources. He was directly corresponding with this local little FBI field agent. And the FBI field agent said, when Hoover had heard the story, he said, "Okay, this is all a hoax." The FBI agent said, "I've interviewed Dahl. I've spoken with him extensively. And he told me it's not a hoax. I came out and said it was a hoax because I was being threatened and I was being ridiculed. And so I took this position that I'd rather be known as a hoaxer than I'd be known as somebody who was a lunatic or somebody who was being threatened supposedly by the Men in Black." So what the truth is, was Dahl then lying to the FBI agent? Was military intelligence spinning a story? What was Chrisman's reason to stir all this up in the first place if it was just Fred Chrisman? Like, it's a heck of a weird story. And perhaps therein lies some of the elements of the UFO mystery still today, is what narrative do you believe? It's even like David Grush, the whistleblower, and then you get Arrow or ATIP or whatever they're called, right? Saying, it's Arrow, right? Saying, did none of this happen, what Grush is saying? So what department of the government do you believe? Do you believe military intelligence saying this didn't happen? Or do you believe the FBI saying, well, Dahl didn't lie, something did happen? It's very strange. And that's our constant, I suppose, trap that we fall into as people interested in this, is what narrative can you believe? And I mean, I just tend to stand back and go, well, it's interesting. I'm fascinated with the history. I'm fascinated with the mythology. But it's strange.
I always wondered what was going through Palmer's mind when Chrisman came to him and told him this story, because he had already gotten this narrative from him about the Darrow. Did he really believe that Chrisman had encountered a Darrow, or did he know that was just, I mean, that had to be a BS, right? But did he, if so, did he just smell a good story, even if this thing was a hoax? I mean, he's essentially like a reporter, and he's interested in this stuff. So I think maybe whether Palmer thought this is real or not, maybe he thought there was a chance it was real, and that's why he pursued it. But either way, again, if it was just a hoax, it would make a great story.
Oh, absolutely. Flat Rockland says, side note about Fred Chrisman, he co-wrote Murder of a City, Tacoma with John Gold. If anyone can find it, hit me up. Now, my understanding is that John Gold is Fred Chrisman, that somebody told me on the weekend it was a pseudonym that he used. Fred Chrisman also Other than, of course, you mentioned before the links with the Kennedy assassination and Garrison subpoenaing him when he had the trial for Clay Shaw, I believe, in New Orleans. But aside from his involvement in the Shaver mystery that you also pointed out, his involvement in Maury Island, and his involvement in the JFK assassination, or the supposed involvement in the JFK assassination, is he also ran a conspiracy type radio show under the name John Gold in the Tacoma area, where it was like a proto Art Bell. He also was involved in all these weird conspiratorial shenanigans, trying to replace various politicians in town that he didn't like. He was a high school teacher for a while and had a conspiracy club for his senior students. I don't know if they sat around with tinfoil hats on, or he was enmeshed in all this hyper weird stuff. He's one of those figures that, regardless of his genuine power or genuine influence, he was so immersed in so many weird things that it's impossible to almost unravel the Fred Chrisman string. And not only was you're right, he was communicating with Palmer in letters to Amazing Stories before he sent him the one about the Maury Island wreckage, which started, really, it's the only reason we know what Maury Island is today, is because Chrisman sent the data to Palmer, and Palmer hired Kenneth Arnold to investigate it and then wrote the book about it. But he apparently, according to Palmer in that book, when Palmer finally talked to Chrisman on the phone during the Maury Island incident, he recognized the voice as somebody who'd called him multiple times from around the country, supposedly, warning him off the Shaver mystery in the olden days. So what Chrisman's interest in the Shaver mystery and in Maury Island, who knows?
Bizarre. For me, I guess the summer of the saucers began. There was this was in the '60s sometime. There was a TV show called "You Asked for It," and apparently you could write in and they would cover anything you wanted to. Well, I did not even see this program, but my buddy Bill down the street, he came down. He said, "Hey, Steve, there was this film with real flying saucers going over this town," and I think what the film was probably maybe one of those. Remember some of those early like the Utah film with the like the white dots in the sky, the formation. A lot of people said they were just birds or whatever. There were a couple of them, so I'm assuming that's what it was. But that just really fueled my imagination as a kid. And then later on, I was introduced to the books of Frank Edwards. And Frank Edwards had those great anthologies like Stranger Than Science, Strange World. And he covered my first introduction to the Flatwoods Monster, the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins, and even Bigfoot. I don't think they used the term Bigfoot, but he had a chapter in one of those books called The Monster Apes of Oregon. Oh, wow. So that was, and then, of course, in March of 1966, we had that incredible UFO wave in Michigan. A lot of credible people seeing things, including landings and so forth. So with those things in mind, I guess I was infected for good. And then, of course, a few months later, the first flight of the Mothman, and I was done. There was no turning back. But I have great memories of reading Brad Steiger's first book, The Strangers from the Skies, on a muggy summer afternoon. And in more recent years, I discovered a book by Helen and Bryant Reeve.
Flying Saucer Pilgrimage.
Yes, the Flying Saucer Pilgrimage.
You know who published that, right? Too.
That's right. That's
Ray
right.
Palmer,
that's another Palmer book, right? And from the 50s, and it was the Detroit Flying Saucer Club, and of course before my time. But it's a fascinating book. They started this program where they would bring speakers in from all over the world. And the first guy they brought in, of course, was George Adamski, who contacted Orthron in the desert, in the California desert. And the interesting thing was they had all kinds of people. They had some of the contactees that we think are kind of dubious with their claims, but they also had, I think, Edward Ruppelt was there. And I think Kehoe might have come. So they sponsored all kinds of different speakers. But at that time period, people didn't really know what to believe, And I remember in the 70s, there was some special on UFOs, and Jim and Coral Lorenzen were on it. And Jim Lorenzen said, back in the 50s, we thought we were going to solve this mystery within a few years. And here is the 70s, nothing solved. And here we are in the new millennium, and still nothing solved. But I I feel a great deal of nostalgia for those times. I mean, reading Ray Palmer's Flying Saucers magazine and all his other magazines, and subscribing to Saucer News, and
wow.
My friend Kevin got to go to the 1967 Congress of Scientific Ufologists in New York City at the Commodore Hotel. And his mom told me, we were in junior high, and she was actually going to take me too, but my parents decided I wasn't going to be wandering around New York with anybody. So so I had to live vicariously through Kevin, but he met Jim Moseley, Gray Barker, John Keel, and just Alan Greenfield. I did meet Gray Barker briefly some years later at the 1976 MUFON Symposium.
Wow.
I was able to talk to him, but which was very cool. But,
I bet.
But yeah, there's just so many good memories. And back in those days, of course, we were all kind of naive. We really didn't have the knowledge that people like John Keel and Jacques Vallee and so many others now have given us. I was fascinated by the books of Jim and Coral Lorenzen about the humanoids and the landings and so forth. So, boy, just a lot of good memories. And there are times when I will pick up one of those old books, even the contactees, and suspend my disbelief and just pretend the Space Brothers are out there looking after us.
Well, they're more entertaining books. I mean, you mentioned Barker before and Keel, obviously, and we talked about Arnold and Palmer, but those books, like The Coming of the Sources, the Arnold and Palmer book, obviously Mothman Prophecies and anything else John Keel ever wrote, Gray Barker's They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. There's no UFO books written today that are that interesting. Like you felt like you were immersed in this genuine mystery that maybe, like you were saying, perhaps it was solvable, or there was a feeling of real tension in those books. But now, I mean, I don't want to be dismissive, because listen, there are some good things still written in the field, but there aren't books as exciting as those books anymore.
And there were such great writers. I mean, Palmer, if you read any one of his editorials for anything, this guy was just, I wish I had a fraction of the talent that he did. Gray Barker, what an entertaining. Now, he played a little fast and loose with the truth occasionally. I heard an interview with John Keel one time, and he was being asked about Gray Barker. And he said, when Gray Barker wrote They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, he started out very seriously, but then at one point he kind of threw up his hands and just started making it up. and it was even a guy that I was actually lived in the same town I used to. I never met him, but he wanted to publish a book. I don't know if I should mention his name, but Barker published a book that he wrote about the March 1966 Michigan sightings. And Barker said he'd publish it for him, but I want you to pretend to be this particular scientist that is silenced in my book. So he did. And in later years, he admitted, he said, look, I was a young kid. I was 19, so I went with it. But after Barker had died, he admitted it was just made up. So, but still, and Barker's version of the Mothman Prophecies, The Silver Bridge, is a very entertaining book, but quite fanciful in some areas. Some people seem to prefer that book to the Mothman Prophecies, and I have to say, with all due respect, that's absolute heresy. But to each his own.
I prefer Mothman Prophecies too. I have an original copy of The Silver Bridge, and my goodness, is it hard and expensive to find these days. But the reason I have it is because who printed that book, and where was it printed out of?
Exactly.
Ray Palmer, down the road from me. So I had to add it to the Palmer collection, even though he's not listed as the publisher, because I think it's Saucerian, Barker's imprint. Right. But it was Palmer who printed it down the road. He printed a bunch of Barker's stuff.
Right.
And Barker, of course, wrote regularly for Palmer's Flying Saucers magazines, and there's this connection between all of those early the people, I suppose, that I'm particularly interested in, Keel and Barker and Palmer, and there's this interconnection between them all. So we had a question from Horace Smith a minute ago as well, which I can let you field. Oh, hang on. That's not the question. That's his comment that, as you mentioned before, of the 66 flap showed up even in Connecticut. So the story was widespread. He asked, before Maury Island, reports of Arnold's initial sighting spread rapidly and widely. Well, just to qualify, certainly Arnold's report came out before the Maury Island report, but according to Chrisman and Dahl, the Maury Island incident took place actually on the 21st, 3 days before Kenneth Arnold's sighting. Let me get back to the question for you, Stephen. You can field it. Before Maury Island, reports of Arnold's initial sighting spread rapidly and widely. Why did the UP and AP news services pick up the story instead of ignoring it?
Well, one thing I've always wondered, I mean, it's supposed to be 3 days before. If it was a hoax, they could have backdated the hoax. I mean, you know, that's. I always thought that was
sure.
that perhaps the Kenneth Arnold incident is what triggered, you know, the idea to do this. So I can't prove that, but that's what I tend to think.
And just to contextualize it as well quickly, I'm just going to show up a couple photos from the film, which will put spatially, it will put some of this into context. So the Maury Island incident happened on Puget Sound off the shores of Maury Island between Des Moines, which is just really a suburb of Seattle, and Maury Island itself. So here, this is Bob Antone, who's a regular guest on the show, and a local and a tour guide and a wonderful folklorist who took me over to Maury Island. You have to get a ferry over there, and this is us looking at Maury Island. But when and here it is as well with Maury Island in the foreground as we're traveling towards it on the bow of the ferry. But when we're over on Maury Island and we are standing just above the incident site, and you can see in the distance there's Mount Rainier. Like just below us is where they supposedly drove the ship into the shoreline just below us. We're standing on the cliffs looking over where the incident happened. But you can see how close Mount Rainier is to that. So the whole early source of stuff, the Kenneth Arnold sighting, which took place in front of Mount Rainier, and then the Puget Sound incident, the Maury Island incident, took place there. So maybe Dahl and Chrisman were so close, and they're looking up at Mount Rainier and hearing in the reports, and they're like, "Hey, this is really near us. Maybe we can tell the story." Or maybe there was some weird stuff going on in that part of the world. And here is just quickly too. Well, here's the shoreline of Maury Island, which I shot a wonderful interview with Bob Antone on. That's later in the day when we were walking along it, just as the sun was setting. But I think, to Horace's point too, why did it get picked up? I think it was a time where weird things in the skies were particularly of interest because of the Cold War. This is 1947. This is when the National Security Act had just got signed. This is when the Air Force separates from the US Army. It's all in this time period where there's an interest in strange technology, and there's an interest in, or a fear of, weird things in the sky, I think. What do you think about that, Steve?
Yeah, I think that's right. And the thing is, with the press, you never know what they're going to focus on. You never know what's going to trigger the reverberations throughout the media. And for whatever reason, that the flying saucers of Kenneth Arnold did, and it hasn't stopped since.
I have another question for you, Steve, from Flying the Trackway. What time of year was the 66 Michigan flap?
Pretty much March, although I think a lot of stuff was going on throughout the Midwest. It wasn't just Michigan. It just turned out that there was a lot of press there, and probably because Dr. J. Allen Hynek was dispatched from Project Blue Book. He actually asked them when the sighting started, "Do you want me to go down there and check it out?" And they said, "Oh no, don't worry about it. Nobody has said anything." And then Senator Gerald Ford was really upset that some good citizens were reporting these strange things, and why isn't the Air Force taking some interest? So the next day he was dispatched.
And that really leads into, maybe you can tell the story if you want to. That flap is what leads into essentially, ultimately, the Condon Committee, and what changes perhaps the direction of official engagement with ufology, at least or the UFO encounters, at least on a surface level, for a number of decades.
Well, there was always the impression that Project Blue Book was just to appease the public. They weren't that serious about. They would investigate things, but some they would say are not identified or whatever, but you just never got the feeling that they. A lot of people thought there was something really going on behind the scenes, but it's just sort of a front and not very serious. And I think they were happy to get rid of, even if it was just the front, they were happy to get rid of that and turn it over to the University of Colorado. Now the trouble with Condon, he wasn't serious either. And one of the things, the premises, as I recall, the Condon Committee was they were going to test the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and essentially to determine that these aren't extraterrestrial. Well, maybe they aren't, but there's still a unexplained phenomenon there that we must take hold of. And there was even, I think it was it James Saunders that intercepted a memo in the Condon Committee where they essentially said that we have to pretend or show that we're being serious about this when we know it's crap. Or I mean, I'm horribly paraphrasing, but that was published, and that was just kind of pulled the man from behind the curtain, and you knew that they were just squandering this money for nothing. And on the one hand, the Air Force was glad to get rid of it, and on the other hand, these people were not serious about investigations.
Yeah, that was the Lowe memo. You're absolutely right. Who I think was the assistant director or something. He was one of the higher ups under Condon who wrote that memo. Yeah, saying we want the scientific institution to know that we don't take this at all seriously because we all know it's nonsense, but we want the public to kind of think we are taking it seriously. So it was, and one of the things I've always found fascinating about the Condon Committee is I really think that's, like, an historian might say and a broader American historian might say the most important period or incident or event in modern American history was the Civil War, that it reframed what it meant to be a state in America. It reframed what nationhood meant. It restructured and set the tone of America going forward. I think the Condon Committee did the same thing for ufology. When we had what was meant to be an objective scientific approach to the UFO phenomenon, after years of people, obviously led by people like Donald Kehoe, as well as Palmer was talking about it all the time as well, that the Air Force essentially couldn't be relied on or trusted. When we were meant to finally have a civilian organization take care of this, and then it was discovered that the civilian organization had pretty much, or at least the leadership had disdain for the mystery. It did a couple of things. You're right, it let the Air Force get out. So the Air Force didn't have to be publicly involved in it anymore. But it also sent ufology in a couple of directions. One was an increasing spiral into the type of paranoia that was already existent in the writings of Donald Kehoe, but it just became a million times more powerful. The other was, of course, Jacques Vallee, because Jacques Vallee, along with Hynek, was somebody who was initially helping the Condon Committee and was giving them data and information. And after that Lowe memo leaked, Vallee had a kind of come to Jesus moment where he wandered away and said, as he writes in Passport to Magonia, which came out the same year as the Condon Committee was published, he writes, I'm going to throw science overboard. This is probably, along with Hynek, the most important scientist perhaps working in the field. He says science isn't going to solve this. Instead, we need to look to older esoteric traditions. We need to look at things like fairy faith and religious visions. And this sets the tone for the new ufology going forward. This sets the tone for Keelian writings and Vallee stuff and Brad Steiger and all these people that John Keel called 5 years later the new ufology. It kind of took that Condon moment to make some of the ufologists I think you and I are more sympathetic of go, well, we've got to approach this in a different way because science and the establishment clearly aren't doing it for us.
And think of the heresy there, because Vallee, his first two books, Challenge to Science and Anatomy of Phenomenon, were looking at the phenomena more in a very solid ET perspective. And even Keel felt that way earlier. But I remember reading things about how that Vallee has lost it now. He's just lost his marbles. He's lost his way. And of course, I remember in the old Flying Saucer Review, which was a great British publication. I think it's still around, but it started in 1955. And back then it was acceptable to say flying saucer. But I remember when Gordon Crichton was at the helm, was the editor, he wrote an editorial one time talking about how people, they didn't want to hear read Keel's articles in Flying Saucer Review, because again, it was sacrilege, it was blasphemy, it was heresy. But he said, and the thing is about Crichton, I believe he was the first Westerner to look at the jinn and seeing the parallels with modern day UFO experiences. And he wrote an article in, was 81 or 83 in Flying Saucer Review. So he was already, Crichton was already open and was a good man to have at the helm to allow people like Keel to write for Flying Saucer Review. Very, very interesting.
Indeed. No, I think I absolutely agree with you. We have a question I'll let you field from Finding the Trackway. Could the chase across Ohio in 66 also be interrelated with Michigan, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia?
Is that the Dale Spar incident, I wonder? There was that. I remember Dale Spar was a police officer. I think he saw this thing take off. And then, it wasn't, did he just saw some light in the sky? And I know that went across Ohio, and I don't remember, but it was at the same time period, as I recall. And his life was ruined from chasing this thing. And it was obviously some kind of anomaly, because, again, that he, and I don't know if he had a partner or not, but I remember hearing about this object actually taking off the ground and then taking off across the sky. So it wasn't like he was chasing Venus or a Chinese lantern or something.
I think that's what also inspired the Close Encounter scene, right, where the police are chasing the UFOs, and
Right.
Neary jumps in his truck behind them and chases them, and they go. One of the police cars goes off the cliff because the saucer goes following the highway, and then I think that was a period where all of these flaps, something was happening. Whether something was happening where the Vallee character in Close Encounters, played by the French director Truffaut, says this is a sociological phenomenon. Maybe this is all sociological somehow. I don't know, but maybe that whatever was happening, there was this kind of broad flap of weirdness going on across America in that time period.
I think I don't know if it was Hynek or Vallee that suggested to Spielberg that they not make it extraterrestrial necessarily, or make it more ambiguous. But of course, Spielberg went with the ET concept.
Yeah, Vallee was quite upset. You're right, it was Vallee, and he was apparently quite disappointed that he. And you know what? I think Close Encounters, to be honest, is probably, other than the Mothman prophecies, well, it doesn't really talk about UFOs. I think Laura Linney says Strange Lights in the Skies or something, but I think those are the two greatest UFO movies ever made. And Close Encounters is so great up until that final Disney-esque ending, which, I mean, the film kind of required it dramatically, I think, but I agree with Vallee's point. Like, imagine if that film had ended without us knowing that this wasn't just some extraterrestrial friendly star beings, if it had kept the weirdness the way the Mothman prophecies does. And the Mothman prophecies, I've heard a lot of people in the community critical of the Mothman prophecies because it isn't a direct adaptation of Keel's book, right? But what to me is more important than having a literal direct adaptation is the Mothman prophecies, just like Close Encounters does, perhaps up until the kind of Disney-esque ending. It captures the weirdness and the high strangeness of what these experiences are like. Mothman prophecies captures the dread, the eeriness, and Close Encounters just captures just the general disarray that witnesses and experiences' lives are thrown into who encounter these kind of things.
Well, my first reaction was I was living in a little town called Marshall, like near Battle Creek, and I was looking forward to this movie, even though Richard Gere wasn't my most favorite actor at the time. So I went and I saw it, and I was disappointed because I didn't feel it had enough of the film, the book in it. And a little bit later, I thought, well, they couldn't really portray the Men in Black properly, because we've already had two silly films spoofing it, so it would just make it look ridiculous. And I had a chance to talk to the screenwriter, and it's one of these times when the name just flew out of my head. It'll come to me. Oh gosh, my apologies, but it'll come to me.
I'll find the name while you tell the story.
Okay. I saw him at I think it was the Small Town Monsters event last year, and he was there talking to people. And just a great guy, and we were able to talk to him about how the screenplay came about. And one of the things they told him was, we don't want you to do much with the UFO stuff. We want you to emphasize the Mothman. And he had to do that. Now, if people, I don't know if you have the DVD set, but if people have that, on the extras, you'll find there are deleted scenes where you can see they were trying to get more of the book into the movie, including the aspect of the way Keel talked about the way the UFOs seem to go through the color spectrum to manifest and to demanifest.
It's Richard Hatem.
Richard Hatem. Okay, good. Fine. Yes, and he was just really a fascinating guy, and he was. And you can see him interviewed on the Mothman Legacy, which is a sequel to the Mothman of Point Pleasant done by Small Town Monsters.
You're in that as well, I think, aren't you? You're in one of those documentaries.
Yeah. You'll see my handsome countenance in there, Dean, if you watch closely enough.
It's a good documentary.
But he talks about, he's very interesting. He talks about how he, when he first got into this, he was going to solve the mystery. He was going to just dive into it and actually make some progress. And then he, like so many of us, he hit a brick wall. And now he's kind of a sit back and watch proposition. But you can tell he was fascinated by Keel. Oh, and another thing I was able to tell him, Brent Raines, who's written a great book on John Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries. He talked to, I think, Sarah Martin, who was Keel's literary agent. And she got Keel's reaction, his first reaction to reading Richard Hatem's screenplay. And she said he was so happy, he was laughing. I guess he'd gotten so many screenplays where they were just turning Mothman into a monster. But he said, finally, somebody has captured the essence of some of the ideas of the book. And he was just ecstatic. And he even wrote an article in Fate magazine around that time praising Hatem. Now, Richard Hatem didn't know any of this. So I was able to tell him, you got to get Brent Raines' book because Keel absolutely loved you. So he had met him and got along with him well, but he had no idea how thrilled Keel was with Richard Hatem's script on the Mothman Prophecies. And at this point in time, I watch it over and over again. I love that film. And I have to, as someone who really loves film soundtracks, that's an amazing soundtrack by Tom and Andy.
Oh, it's excellent. And this is something that always strikes me, and I'm always conscious of when people in the field are critical of the movie, is what you said. Keel was tickled pink by the movie. I saw him before the movie had been released, but when the movie was being made, I was at Fort Fest 99 in Maryland, and I got to spend some time with John, and I also got to listen to his presentations. And he talked quite a bit about thinking how grand it was that Richard Gere was playing his character in the film and how excited. So he was obviously conscious of what was going on.
Yes.
So he seemed, and not to mention, my understanding is too, this was the first time he ever got a real paycheck for the Mothman Prophecies. He never really made any money off the book, so he finally got a payday. So it was it's a wonderful film. I'm assuming most of our audience have watched it, but if they haven't, they should go and watch it, because again, it isn't a direct adaptation of the book, although it captures for me the atmosphere and the creepiness of the book far better than I ever could have imagined a Hollywood production doing. We have a question for you from Horace Steve. It says, who created the striking background behind Steve Ward?
Well, the striking background of the Mothman, this is my expensive studio. It's actually, don't tell anybody, but is a shower curtain with the Mothman on it. So, we have to watch the budget.
Oh, wow. I always thought it was a Mothman flag. Now I know it's a show. I can hear a train behind you too, that long whistle whine.
I'm in between two train tracks here. So, but, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I still got to make the trip down there, Steve, and crash on your couch next to your cats or something. I have to take antihistamines. I love cats, but I need to be antihistamine done.
Okay. Well, I'll vacuum as much as possible. But at that time period, John Keel hadn't done an interview for a long time, but he was interviewed by Art Bell on Coast to Coast AM, and Art Bell didn't know anything about the Mothman. And this was a time period when Keel was being forgotten. I think maybe the only book that stayed in print was the Mothman Prophecies, and all his other stuff was being forgotten. And me, I was worshiping at the Church of John Keel for decades, But Bell asked him about the movie. He said, "I like the movie." He said, "The thing it really got was the paranoia I felt at the time." And remember, there's a chapter in the Mothman prophecies that say paranoiacs are made, not born. And so he was very happy with the book, with the movie.
I love the I love the what am I holding in my hand scene where he's having the phone call. Chapstick.
And if you go to the Mothman Museum, there's a whole wall full of memorabilia from the film, including the chapstick. And it also has, remember the pictures that Mrs. Gear, Deborah
Messing,
was all those illustrations are there in a frame. Yeah. So there's a lot of cool stuff. But and I love the interchange between Richard Gere. And by the way, my reluctance to have Richard Gere in the role completely disappeared because he nailed that. He nailed Richard Klein so amazingly, and the scenes he had with Alan Bates were phenomenal as Dr. Leak. I mean, I just you talk about two phenomenal actors, playing off each other. And the scene I love the most. Now Dr. Leak is a guy who's been through all this, and he's kind of like John Keel. Leak spelled backwards, Keel, but he's lost everything in his life, and he doesn't want to revisit it. Here you got Richard Gere's character, Richard Klein. He's going through this now, and he wants to solve the mystery. And he's trying, there's people he loves that he thinks might be in danger. So he's talking to Dr. Leak, and he says, "Didn't you need to know?" And Alan Bates plays it so well. He looks at him, he cocks his head a little bit, and says, "We're not allowed to know." There were so many good scenes with those guys.
It's a great line. And you know what? It's funny. I got chills when you said that because that's my suspicion. My suspicion is we're never going to know any of this. All these people who are hoping for disclosure from the US government, all they really want, I've said it again and again and again, all they really want is for the government to tell them, "You're right, we have bodies from Roswell, we have crash sources." That's not disclosure. That's just confirming a segment of the UFO community's belief system. They wouldn't, if they would say there was a UFO truth that wasn't Roswell and crash sources, if the truth was, we have no idea, but we've been tracking things that we can't explain, and they don't seem to be of a traditional physical origin. But that isn't what anybody wants who wants disclosure. They want the Roswell narrative, the MJ-12 narrative, handed to them as the official narrative.
And that's why it is so great to go back to the motif of the Summer of the Saucers and kind of revisit that time period when we were all, the sense of wonder, that childish sense of wonder that John Keel said he never lost. And so it's just, I just absolutely love I'm really glad that now I wasn't around in 47 or too long in the 50s, but I did live through a lot of the 60s, and I lived through a lot of the original books being published, and even at the time, the National Enquirer would cover a lot of UFO stuff. They're the first ones to break the Travis Walton case in the National Enquirer. So, we had these great publications, the UFO Report, every month for years. It had all kinds of great authors in it, and all kinds of it had some of the ancient astronaut stuff to Keel to conventional ET UFOs. And there were quite a few publications at the time, and I was subscribing to everything, from magazines on Atlantis to paganism to OASP to Ray Palmer and there's a fine line between Palmer Publications and then Timothy Green Beckley when he picked up. There's just kind of the lines blurred, and you can't always remember who published what. But yeah, there's so much good stuff out there, and you can still find some of it. I mean, a lot of it's gone to third-party pirates and is unaffordable, as you know. We both have purchased great classics of the originals that have been a little pricey.
They sure are now. It's the prices have really shot up in like the last 20 plus years as well. You could still get really good stuff affordably when I was doing my dissertation. You really have to pay through the nose for it. But speaking about publications and speaking about Palmer, I thought we might want to mention quickly
Oh, yes.
the magazine that was on the newsstand at the start of the Summer of the Sources. It was the June 1947 issue of Amazing Stories, which was the all shaver mystery issue, the most sensational true story ever told. And we can talk a little bit about this issue, but what I found, of course, most fascinating with it is when Kenneth Arnold has his sighting above Mount Rainier in June 24, 1947, there's already an article by the great Fortean Vincent Gaddis in the magazine
Yes.
we're looking at the cover of now called Visitors from the Void, which is
Right.
about flying saucers and the history of flying saucers without having the term flying saucers being introduced as meaning spaceships from other worlds yet, but it's essentially what Gaddis is talking about. So any reader of Amazing Stories, and by this stage I think it was up to 250,000 circulation, any reader of Amazing Stories, when those things appeared in the skies, would have gone, oh, Gaddis, Visitors from the Void, Kenneth Arnold. They would have put two and two together instantly.
Right. Isn't it? It's bizarre. I mean, just before Kenneth Arnold's sighting, he writes this article about saucers of not so much antiquity, but from the past. And it really is. I revisited that not too long ago and talked about it on Mac Maloney's show. And that
nice.
was fun.
I have to go and find that episode.
Now, I do have, I think, most of the original Amazing Stories with the Shaver mystery, with the Shaver stories, and with all the extra blurbs on the Shaver mystery, and that's another. We've talked about that before, but ladies and gentlemen, the Shaver mystery. Whether you think Shaver was totally crackers or was tuned into a source of information, it's one of the most fascinating periods in the history of, well, in history, really. I mean, I wouldn't just put it in a small box or category. It's this Shaver was a fascinating guy, and I think that while I'm not too sure that there are really Darrow deep beneath the earth aiming tamper rays at us, although I like to blame tamper rays on some things sometimes. I think that I really believe that Shaver was tapped into something, some kind of a source of information, maybe a little bit like channelers do. That doesn't mean the information is objectively true, but I don't think he was just making it up, and I don't think he was just crazy.
It's interesting because I think Ray Palmer had a similar sense that Shaver was having genuine experiences, but they mightn't have been physically in the caves, along the lines of a Waspy, which you might have mentioned before, the type of New Agey, pre-New Agey Bible of the 19th century. But recently, which first fascinated me, there's been a couple of journal articles that have essentially vindicated some of Shaver's ideas. One was by Hal Puthoff a year or two ago called the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. And one of the suggestions there was these things could live underground, which are behind the saucer mysteries. And more recently, there was, it only dropped like this month, from two Harvard researchers and some other academic from some other university, not that that means anything, but they had a similar thing about the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, and they talk at length about the Shaver mystery in there. Like, there's a good paragraph talking about, well, Richard Shaver was saying this. So it's interesting to think that, it's interesting to think that people are now looking again in locations where, for most of modern ufology's history, they've tended to look to the stars, but now there seems to be a resurgence, perhaps hinted at in the works of Keel and Vallee anyway, that it might be here amongst us. But there's been people from MacTonnies was another person, the late MacTonnies in the crypto-terrestrials, who there's been a few people who've suggested, well, maybe these things are closer. And now people are literally saying maybe they're under the earth. And whether they are or not, it's for me a real kick to see that kind of Shaver interpretation of UFO belief being introduced in journal articles written by academics. So go figure.
Are you familiar with the book Shimmering Light by Walter Bosley?
No, I haven't read it. Tell me a little bit about it.
He was involved in intelligence, but his father was, and I have to condense this, but his supposedly his father was part of a retrieval team for crashed airplanes, and he was diverted one time. There was a saucer crash not too far from the Roswell, and it was the same people that flew the Roswell craft. But Bosley said, his father said, and that this came out piecemeal. His father didn't talk about this for years, but it came out piecemeal toward the end of his days. And it turned out that they were a crypto-terrestrial race that were very much like us, but wanted nothing to do with us. And we helped them, get retrieved from this crash saucer. And anyway, it's a fascinating book. Now Bosley doesn't. He takes it with a grain of salt. He thought that it's perhaps his father was being mind controlled to cover up something else. He was not. He said there's some flaws in what his father said, but it's a fascinating story. And if I had to choose what I thought Roswell was, that would be my choice. That it's actually some kind of crypto-terrestrial race and not ET. It just sounds so much cooler.
Oh, I agree. And as Susie mentioned a moment ago in the chat, there's lots of lore about little people in caves and underground. I'm fascinated with fairy faith as well. I'm fascinated with the Shaver mystery. So if there was a physical answer to the UFO phenomenon, I don't think there's going to be, but if there was, I'd be just so much more excited that it was something like that it was ETs traveling here in tin cans from outer space, So
I have to think there's a duality, though. I mean, you're familiar with Albert Rosales, of course, and his incredible database of
they're amazing books. They're so good.
But when you go through them all, there are many that could easily fit in the Keel hypothesis, the ultra-terrestrials, the whatever the entities that we co-create or what have you. But some of them do seem to be very physical, and perhaps they are coming from elsewhere, whether it's they're crypto-terrestrial, interdimensional, or even off-world. So I think that probably I've come to believe that although the pendulum has swung back and forth for me, there was a time, Dean, when I actually told people that I think that none of this is physical. We're dealing with psychic manifestations of a collective human subconscious. Then, of course, they would put me in a straitjacket in a padded room. But I since then, I think that we may actually be dealing with, if there's one crash saucer that's legit, then it's in the physical. And in some cases, it does seem like, even with some of the cryptids, some of them do seem like they might actually be physical unknowns. But so many of them are like the more I get into the Loch Ness Monster, Ted Holliday, F.W. Holliday, has written a series of fascinating books that I think influenced Keel about the origins of the actual essence of the Loch Ness Monster.
No, I think Holliday's books are fantastic as well. And he's definitely a researcher up there on that level of Keel and Vallee and Patrick Harper and the like. I mean,
yes.
Many of these guys have informed my thinking. And Flat Rockland just says, and I think he's right too, that's where I'm at, something to do with our collective unconscious. I think it does have something to do with us. I suspect, and I've long suspected, that it might be something like Greg Bishop recently suggested in his wonderful piece in UFOs Reframing the Debate in the Robbie Graham anthology, which Graham published before Graham passed, of various UFO authors, is that there's some co-creation going on. If there's an intelligence which is independent from us, and I think there may very well be, somehow we're contributing to what we're seeing as well, which goes a long way to explaining strange differences from person to person and their experiences. It also goes a long way to explaining changes historically, culturally, when people encounter these things. Well, there are some similarities. There also seem to be historical differences that seem to be up to speed with wherever we are culturally. So the great airship flap, of course, fits that kind of dream of flight in the late 18th, early 19th century. Earlier tales of fairies and shining castles and the like fits those kind of flaps. The UFO phenomenon fits our concept of space travel on the cusp of the space race, at the beginning of the arms race, and in relation to the type of science fiction which people have been consuming in the pulp magazines of the, at least 10 years previously. So there does seem to be some back and forth, I think, between the phenomenon and us and how how we perceive it or how it presents, and whether that's conscious, whether it's consciously going, that's what he expects to see, or whether there is something happening at a far deeper, stranger level where we're putting our own input into what it's feeding back to us. So that's my, and none of us know, of course, this is all hypothesis, and this is all just us throwing around theories, but I tend to drift into that type of direction. Mind you, again, it'd be so much fun if there really were physical crypto-terrestrials living in the Darrow caverns. So
yeah, as long as they weren't taking us down there to serve man, that would be all right. But
that's a scary thing, unless it's a sweet Nydia who comes and takes you, like in the Shaver story, his underground lover.
Yeah,
which is like a fairy faith as well, right? That's a big part of fairy faith as well.
Yeah.
Beautiful maidens from under the earth taking humans to
Well, Keel was onto the paranormal mimicry thing very early on, and talked about the reflective factor. And it's interesting when we look at some of the Bigfoot reports out in the Northwest. Now, even some of those that seem to be very much flesh and blood have a high strangeness aspect, but then compare them to the ones in Pennsylvania, southwest Pennsylvania, in 73 to 74. That's if they're both paranormal, one is at a much higher level of paranormally reality than the other.
Oh, indeed. We had a fun comment from Susie saying, group field trip to Mammoth Cave is in order. Funnily enough, I thought about going to Mammoth just to shoot a little bit for the documentary, because of course there were shaver groups that were saying that Mammoth Cave is one of the entrances to the cavern. The cavern's world. None of us might come back though. Just hope the tarot take us instead of the Darrow is all I can say.
Yeah.
Steve, you're a fantastic guest as you always are. Can you tell people where they can find what you're up to?
Well, you can. I don't have a website. I'm very low tech, but you can. If you type in Steve Ward in Point Pleasant, you'll probably find me on Facebook. I have a podcast on the High Strangeness Factor on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Andy Mercer and I have been doing it for about 5 years, and in fact, Susie Bastille is a frequent host on that show. And I'm also a correspondent on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files, which is a real hoot and a lot of fun. And well, thank you, Pugwudgie Whisperer. We appreciate that. And let's see what else. I am really writing a book, but I admit I don't know when it's going to appear. I did write a joint book with Mark Randall called Mothman High Strangeness. Mark Randall is a great graphic artist, and this small book chronicles what I call the year of the Garuda, the year of the Mothman, and these fantastic illustrations. And he and I wrote the pieces for it. I wrote the piece for John Keel, the Men in Black, the Silver Bridge, and I'm not sure what the other one was, but it's been a while since I looked at it.
Is that available on Amazon if people want to get it?
Yes, it's available on Amazon, and you still might be able to find Weird Winged Wonders, which was edited by Tim Beckley. And I have an article in there, big surprise, on the Mothman. I mean, with very good company like Brad Steiger and Scott Corrales and so forth. So it was a surprise from Tim Beckley. He took some material that I wrote for Brent Rains, and he had asked for some photographs of the Mothman statue and so forth. So, and then all of a sudden I get this book, and I'm in it. So I thought I was kind of thrilled. That was my first publishing event, I guess.
Wow. I'll have to, yeah. I don't have that one. I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah.
But thanks so much for coming on the show, Steve. It's always a wonderful joy to talk to you.
Well, thanks for having me. It's just always a blast. And with great listeners out there. Great questions.
Oh yeah, we had some wonderful people in the chat. And until I get to talk to you again, Steve, which hopefully will be sometime in the very near future, until I get to talk to everybody else out there, please keep it weird.